Okay, today we are going to talk about royal sponsorship. And you probably heard royal and you immediately think of kings and queens. And that's absolutely right. We're going to definitely be talking about kings and queens. Sponsorship, you may not know, but we're going to explain that here in just a second. So I'm going to give you the Mrs. Guard version of this. So when you do your assignment, you'll have to read back through the paragraphs. But I'm going to give you the overview of each of these. So exploring new lands was expensive. You had to have ships, you had to have crews, you had to have supplies, and those things were not cheap. So explorers, before they went out on a trip, they had to get sponsorships. And sponsor just means to give a person or a group money. They need to pay for an activity. So if you've ever been a part of a sports team, you may be sponsored, maybe, like the football team was sponsored by this, or if you've ever seen on some of the jerseys, they'll have like the name of a company or a business, right? Those are sponsors, people giving you money so you can play whatever it may be, whatever sport that may be. So these explorers needed sponsorships too, and they needed it from people that had money. And during this time, the people that had the most money were royal families, so kings and queens from different places. If the king and queen sponsored an explorer, that explorer became an ambassador for the country. And an ambassador is just a representative, which means if they went off and find something really cool or find some new place, they are representing that country, not just themselves anymore. And mostly because the sponsors wanted things from these explorers. They weren't just giving them money to go, they didn't say, here's your money, go have a good time. They wanted something in turn, right? So the explorers had to go, and they either had to bring back things to trade, or they had to find new trade routes, or they had to find new land for these countries that were sponsoring them. And the Age of Exploration, which we've talked about a bunch, started around the same time that a lot of monarchies meaning royal families, and governments were set up in Europe. So some of the royals were interested in exploring while others were not. Some countries were not united enough to organize expeditions, meaning they were brand new countries. They were baby countries. They weren't organized enough. They weren't ready to start spending money on things like that. They were still focused on what they had to do in their land right there. They didn't need to worry about other countries. They had enough to worry about in their own country. Italy was one of those countries that didn't get too involved in exploration. It was not united at the time. Italy wasn't nearly as powerful as countries like Spain and Portugal. And let me pull up a map of Europe so you guys can see where these countries are. Let's try this one. There we go. So Italy right here. So Spain and Portugal, big countries that were exploring. France was another one that sent a lot of explorers. There were a lot of other European countries that did too, but these were kind of the big ones that were exploring. England was late to join the Age of Exploration. There wasn't a lot of interest in exploring in the country at first. This changed in the late 1500s when the new groups came into power. So powerful religious groups wanted to explore so they could spread Christianity. We talked about that before, right? That God was a motivation, and that came a lot from England, which, United Kingdom right up here. And that's actually why some of us are here right now, is because of our ancestors, to use a vocabulary word, coming from these different countries, right? Prince Henry, we talked about Prince Henry. He was from Portugal. So if we look back at our map, tiny little country right here, right? And he was the first one to sponsor trips. We talked about the School of Navigation that he started, right? And actually, after Henry died, his nephew, who was another royal, came from a royal family, continued to sponsor trips. This started a pattern of royals sponsoring explorers. Portugal started off with the lead. Spain was busy fighting a war when they first started, but Spain soon joined and started sending out lots of explorers too. Spain and Portugal became the leaders during the Age of Exploration. So those two countries were really the big boom that started all of this. And as we get into colonies and things like that, we'll see some of the influence from Spain and Portugal and France here, even in our own country. But getting a sponsorship was not easy. There were a lot of things that had to happen for them to get that sponsorship. So explorers needed connections, meaning they needed to know people in high places. They needed to know royals in order to share their plans. Many famous explorers you know about were born into wealthy families, meaning they had connections. They used their family connections to get a chance to speak. Even after sharing their plans, the royals could still turn them down. So maybe, Christopher Columbus said, hey, I've got this great idea, and the royal says, nope, not interested. They could be turned down. Some records show that Christopher Columbus was turned down by four different times by 2 different kings. So he had this great presentation set up, all these great things. He had learned all these new things and had this great plan. And 2 different kings, 2 different times said, nope, sorry, not interested. Many explorers actually moved country to country for sponsorship. Columbus was an example. He was born in Italy, so he was born here, but he actually moved and became an inhabitant, a person that lived in Spain, because finally the king and queen of Spain decided, yep, we'll sponsor you. So they would move around. If you kind of think of it almost like professional athletes will move from team to team to get what they want, right? Explorers did some the same things. Most royals didn't know a lot about exploration, so they hired people to help them make these decisions, which is super smart, right? They don't know a lot about it, so they're going to find people that did. So they made these committees. It was people that were from the church. It was scholars, meaning people like professors, people that were just really, really smart people. People that would, sailors, right, that knew a lot about these. The churchmen helped decide if the expedition was a good use of the church's money, the country's money. So they would help decide, is this really worth us spending all this money? The scholars, or the people that were extremely bright, smart, intelligent, checked calculations and information in the explorer's plan. This is like what Mrs. Young does when she goes back and checks your work to make sure you've got it all right, or Mrs. Harshman goes back and checks your math work to make sure everything's all right. That's exactly what these scholars were doing. The seamen or the sailors would share their travel wisdom. So these are people that had already been out on expeditions, and they would say, yep, this is a good plan, we think this is a good idea, or no. But these committees could turn explorers down for any reason. So lots of trips were turned down because they were too expensive, or maybe they had the wrong information or measurements. That would be a bad thing, right? If the explorer said, well, here's where we're going, give us all this money, and then we find out, guess what, that's not where you were going, you were in the wrong direction. That's a big problem, right? Royals also turned explorers down if they were focused in an area that the royal wasn't interested in. So maybe they said, hey, we're here, we really want to go and explore Australia. We've heard that there's this long off land called Australia, and maybe the royal says, I don't want to go to Australia. I want to find things that are in Asia. So they could say, nope, sorry, we're not paying for that trip. That's not where we're interested in going. Most of the famous explorers from this age were sponsored by Portugal or Spain. And when we look about some of the famous explorers, which we're getting ready to get into, you'll see a lot of them were sponsored by or lived in the country of Portugal or Spain. France and England did join later. However, think about the history of the United States and parts of North America. You might notice something. You're going to realize that France and England claim most of the land here, not Spain and Portugal. Spain and Portugal were more focused on South America, which is why people that were in South and Central America speak Spanish and Portuguese, and people here in North America, so in like the United States and Canada, we speak English and French. Kind of makes sense, right? So it just depends on where they were interested in exploring. Exploring new lands across the ocean was also not cheap. Money was needed. Oh, you know what? I put 2 on here. That's why. Totally disregard that last part. We'll just be moving on, ready for the next section of doing main idea and detail.